Alrighty. So welcome to, as I'll let you know, the last lecture of the term for Sociology. Again, we don't have a make-up Monday for this class because the Tuesday class lost a lecture as well. So you're both going to stay on the same page. So test 1 grades were released yesterday, or the day, yesterday morning, I think. So the average was about 61%, and so a few percent lower than SA1, but pretty much what we expected. So I took out some questions that most of the class got wrong to get to that number. So I didn't curve it, but there were some that I think maybe the wording was ambiguous, and I noticed clusters of responses that were not what I had in mind. So after removing those, again, the average is 61. Well, we're going to arrange office hours because I know that all of you have exams in your other courses right now, and I don't want you to be stressed out about this test. So we'll definitely have review sessions for you to see the tests. You won't get them back physically, but you can review your short answer and multiple choice questions. We'll have those early in January, so that way you can kind of figure how to study better for test 2 if you didn't perform as well as you'd like. Since that test is next year and not in December. So not as much point reviewing now when you might forget some of the kind of errors you were making. Okay, so we are on our last topic of the term, and then as promised, I'll try to make this lecture more interactive based on, I read through more of the comments on the tests, so I'm definitely going to try to be incorporating more fun and meaningful discussion and prompts for discussion as the term progresses. So this lecture I'll try to end a bit early to give us more time for the little holiday event that I planned for the last bit of our lecture, which hopefully should be fun and should help you solidify some more of your budding friendships with your future sociologists in this class. I know, unfortunately, attendance is pretty low today. Hopefully it's not because of the grades being released, but it is the last week also, so I know some people may not come, although I was hoping everyone would be here. I made way too many of my little activity prompts than what I needed. Okay, so sexuality. So you'll see the first slide we discuss, again, as sociologists, always looking at norms, rules, mores, all those cultural things. We're very interested in how any given topic, as we'll see later, the media, crime, and as we've seen before, last week, gender, and then next term, race. As sociologists, we're always interested in how various phenomena take on meaning in a given social context. So you'll see the lecture begins with this idea of sexuality and sexualities as being socially constructed. So this builds right off of the kind of binary that we discussed last week and in the culture week as well. So remember we talked about sociobiological and evolutionary psychological perspectives taking a very person-based focus on any given topic. So a person's performance at school, a person's sexual preferences, and so on and so forth. Starting from a sociological perspective means instead looking at point number 1 there, that the meanings of all of the sorts of things we do can't be divorced from the contexts and the histories in which those contexts exist, from how those contexts shape what we're doing. So we'll see this week, again, how attitudes towards sexuality have changed over time, and we'll discuss kind of 5 core kinds of sexuality, and then sexual arrangements like monogamy and non-monogamy. And we'll talk about how these are relatively new, some of the terms like asexual and pansexual, but just as Durkheim discussed, even though these norms are new, it doesn't mean that they're taken on totally completely and in an accepted way by society. And sometimes it takes a long time for people to get on the same page about new ideas. So as sociologists, it's interesting to see how even though our idea of sexuality, so you'll see here it's sexualities, that's also of the plural is important as Western societies become more open with its general view of sexuality and acknowledging multiple sexualities and multiple genders and again becoming more all-embracing. There still are important norms shaping and limiting the extent to which people feel free expressing their sexuality and expressing their gender identities. So as you'll see, things have opened up, but there are still what a sociologist would call normative sanctions and normative constraints and tabooed sexualities. Again, one of my research topics was on pedophilia, and clearly that's a sexuality. Many people don't even think of it as a sexuality, they just think of it as a form of deviance completely. But that clearly is a sexuality that is against the law, and many people have very negative views about particularly active pedophiles. So again, in society, you'll see the approach to sexualities. As the lecture ends, we'll see that you can apply many different theories to the study of sexuality and sexualities. But I think it really does lend itself well to symbolic interactionism and conflict theory / feminist theory, depending on the perspective you take. You'll see sexualities. What we learned about gender and doing gender, people tend to do their sexuality the same way. So based on the society and the neighborhood you live in, you learn certain ideas about what's appropriate for someone in your gender role. You experience your own kind of fleeting sensations. Oftentimes those align, but for members of the LGBTQ, they don't. And then the conflict you experience leads you to think and reflect about who you are, who you're interested in, whether having a sexual monogamous relationship is for you, or whether something inside of you wants something else. So you'll see different theoretical perspectives can apply to this, but what they have in common again are, from a sociological perspective, the idea that we're all being socialized about acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And again, members of the LGBTQ community experience a great deal of conflict, although to different extents around the world, based on the extent to which people think they're breaking certain norms of sexual conduct. And then just that example with kissing. So historically, or just over time, how we've deemed certain acts as sexual, that's very clear as well. So kissing is something intimate, although family members can kiss one another on the cheek. In some cultures, a light peck on the lips. And then there's full out like French kissing, open mouth kissing. Obviously that has, people say, get a room or whatever. That's because it clearly has very intimate sexual connotations. But kissing is not something that is done in every single culture, and even in Western culture is a relatively recent phenomenon. In part, that might be because of massive advances in oral hygiene over the last couple of hundred years. So you can imagine kissing someone and doing all sorts of other things when you only bathed like once a month and didn't know what a toothbrush was. It might not be considered what it is now with perfumes and scents and all these things. Or maybe I'm just imposing my modernist lens on people who like stench and find that attractive. Okay, so again, how, as a sociologist, do you study sexuality and sexualities? The study of sexuality, oftentimes it's put the same week as gender, because how we see ourselves as kind of sexual entities, or don't, typically is very based on how we view ourselves as masculine or feminine. Again, we'll get to this when we discuss heterosexuality, but as I'm sure most of you are aware and familiar with, in the media there tend to be portrayals of a certain kind of woman and a certain kind of man that members of the opposite sex will find attractive. There can be various categories. There can be the real beefcake dad guy, there can be the dad bod, there can be the skater boy, there can be whatever. There's a whole bunch of archetypes and stereotypes where there can be the attractive librarian or the MILF or whatever for women. There's all categories. But the commonality is they tend to be seen as attractive to the bulk or a big amount of members of the opposite sex. And they also tend to subscribe to aspects of masculinity or femininity. So a guy can be skinny, for example, but he may also be punky, or he may be particularly innovative or hip or something. So he has part of the masculine persona, but not all of it. Similarly, a woman could be very, in a stereotypical way, could be very assertive and independent, but then also still presents herself in a very feminine way. The kind of archetypal, powerful yet elegant or svelte woman. So usually the images tend to be framed around parts of those definitions we learned last week of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. And again, so these are shaped through language and interaction. So again, getting rid of the jargon, just those examples I gave before of being in line at Shoppers Drug Mart with my coffee and then being bombarded with, yes, all of these different magazines. So GQ showing a shirtless, ripped guy obsessed with how he looks, and then seeing Home and Garden where the guy doesn't look like that, but then he's really good at building homes, and then another one about technology talking about Bill Gates. So all these different aspects of things that men can be good at, so intellectual, independent, strong, good with their hands, 3 different kinds of guys having different components of that. And then the same with more feminine-oriented magazines, maybe Martha Stewart Living or something, looking at cooking and home decor, and then another one on fitness, being very slender, and then another one on, say, interior design or something. So this is, again, those are more about masculinity and femininity than they are sexuality and sexual orientation. But these ideas of ourselves, they're very linked with how we see ourselves as gelling with other members of our species. So a sexual orientation classically has been defined as an individual's sexual and or emotional. So we'll see that becomes important when we discuss some of the more newly discovered or formulated sexualities like asexuality. But this is a person's sexual and or emotional attraction to a person of a particular gender. So typically you would say your sexual orientation is straight or gay or bisexual or pansexual or asexual. And those, although there are other sexualities emerging or dormant sexualities that we're discovering, however you want to put that, but typically it's based on your preference for which kind of gender expressing individual you want to be with. And again, over time, this has become much more complex, recognizing a spectrum of attractions, whereas historically in Western culture anyway, everyone was presumed straight and liking the member of the opposite sex. Or again, gender was not a term. If you were more masculine or feminine, that was seen as not being linked to your sexuality. And if you didn't like the member of the opposite sex, that's where that term queer came from, which is essentially that you have a strange or queer sexuality. Again, we'll see with other words, queer has been reclaimed, that's why it's part of LGBTQ, to acknowledge that having a diverse or different sexual orientation is totally acceptable. Okay, so before we'll go over the 5 sexualities, which are fairly self-evident, I think, in particular the homosexual, straight, and bisexual. and then we'll have some nice discussion questions. Okay, so homosexuality. So this is defined as someone who is attracted to someone of the same gender. So if you identify as a man, being attracted to a man, identify as a woman, attracted to women. What you do with that attraction is up to you, whether your ideal is to set up shop, have get married, have children, or go on Tinder and Grindr and all these things and just grind and Tinder your way around the universe. That's fine too. Or do that till age 25 or whatever. I can't pretend to know the psyche of youths anymore. But so that is that homosexuality is attraction to the same sex/gender. Again, some people don't make the distinction if they're not sociologically aware of it. Homosexuality, why we're starting with that. So again, gay is for men and lesbians are women, or gay refers usually to males, and lesbian to females or feminine identified people. The study of homosexuality is important because this has been a historically subjugated or oppressed form of sexuality. Again, it's the kind of sexuality that historically stood most opposed to social order as people had imagined it before. Oftentimes homosexuals, the idea would be if someone came out to their family or someone was caught in this act, the automatic response of other individuals was very often not, oh, you're attracted to men or women or whatever, your same gender, but, why the hell are you doing that? What's wrong with you? Why you can't possibly be interested in someone of the same sex? You're just not wired that way. So clearly you've chosen this. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the now dated idea of homosexuality as being a choice. But historically that was very damning and disruptive for a lot of people, and still is today. Many people still do think, for example, that being homosexual is a phase. Maybe someone comes out to their family as a teenager or young adult and then is told, oh, you'll get over this, or you're thinking too much about who you like, just go and find someone nice and don't think about it, just have a family. So again, homosexuality historically has been disruptive and tied to this idea of heterosexism, which again is this idea of heterosexual activity just as being the default behavior in a society. So again, it's very important to see this in a nuanced way. It's not that, someone that comes out to their mom or dad, it's not necessarily that the parent is totally hateful of homosexuals in all cases. It could be that they just don't understand it and they think, well, why are you choosing this weird way of life? Maybe I didn't have a great time with someone of the opposite gender, but I got married and had children. You can do that too. And again, that's grounded in the fact of heterosexual relations just historically being the main kind of family. And so, again, this is going back to the socialization week. Remember, parents are very important here. They're trying to raise their children to meet normative kind of everyday ideals in society. So for many parents, yes, some can be extremely, homophobic towards this. But for others, they think, well, how is my child going to make it in this world? So again, seeing on a case-by-case basis whether that's the distinction between homophobia and heterosexism. Again, heterosexism is having heterosexuality as an ideal or acknowledging it as that. Homophobia is more irrationally, or in your own mind, rationally, really being averse to homosexuals and thinking it's disgusting and taboo and a choice and all of these things. So I think it's an interesting thought exercise to think of people that you know that may be uncomfortable with the idea of homosexuality and thinking, do I think they're just following a norm they've been taught, or are they particularly against this for XYZ reasons? Again, if you're just trying to psychoanalyze people, that's something I always did. I came out when I was like 20. And then I knew I was part of a gaming community, which was largely, straight guys. And when people would react to me, like, oh, like what the hell? Like, because it was two totally different identities to them. I mean, some people knew, but the vast majority of people, it was, no, you're a gamer, you can't be choosing this, or that's not your life, just you haven't met the right woman yet. And in my mind at the time, obviously, I could be hurt, but then over time and having more conversations, for many of them, I just realized that's just what they thought, that's what they were taught. And that's what I was taught as well. And I think for many members of the LGBTQ community, that's part of what makes it so painful. Because even inside, you're thinking like, oh, what's wrong with me? Why am I like obsessed with my sexuality? Why can't I just get married and not think about it? Again, those kind of questions, whatever your internal issue is, I think sociology is very interesting for studying, what is it that made me uncomfortable and hesitant and my friends about that? Again, were we totally nasty people inside, or were we just taught that heterosexuality was the default? And so homosexual identities, again, they're socially produced like everything else. So the ideal of kind of even what a homosexual was, again, it wasn't a term until, a real accepted term until around the 1960s and 50s, when there were a bunch of social movements like Stonewall in 1969, where people in New York City were really fighting for their rights. Around the same time, we'll see in January, of race relations and race fights with the civil rights movement. People reclaiming this identity or claiming it for the first time, saying people have always been homosexual, but we've just been calling it these weird names, and we've never seen these people as part of a kind of dormant community. And obviously now, I mean, we are seeing massive amounts of increased tolerance of homosexual individuals, in part, reflected in the fact that gay marriage is being legalized around the world, something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, and that continues to grow at a growing pace. However, as you see in the case of America, it is a very divisive issue. It's very similar to abortion. It's one of those things. If you have a very strong religious belief against this sort of behavior, gay marriage, like abortion, can represent something much bigger to you than that one issue. That's why these things become such fault lines for people. Again, with homosexuality, part of why I studied pedophilia was people telling me to my face, saying, oh, you're into guys now, what are you going to be, into kids, into dogs, into whatever? And that's how some people think. So it's not going to say scary, but it's the reality. And same with abortion, and even feminist movements and race movements. Going back to Durkheim and classical social thought, sometimes people just really think, okay, you make one change, the whole social order could be disrupted. That's why those old perspectives don't die out. So spent a lot of time on homosexuality, obviously, because that's the kind of key binary opposition to heterosexuality, although as we'll see, it's not the be-all and end-all. People are not just straight or gay. So heterosexuality, I don't need to spend much time on. Obviously, that's attraction to members of the opposite sex or gender identity. And when the textbook says this is reinforced through surveillance, again, I think the easiest way to think of that is to think of those ideals of masculine and feminine, and again, also just, using a real symbolic interactionist perspective. Think of all the conversations you've had, particularly with parents and grandparents and teachers and so on. If they ask you, very often, if you're a guy, they'll ask you, oh, do you have a girlfriend yet? And vice versa, if you're a female, do you have a boyfriend yet? Do you find that guy cute, that girl cute, whatever? Again, it's people, when they're struggling for conversation, will often default to those sorts of casual conversations, although often in their mind not thinking they're reinforcing kind of the normalcy and expectation that pretty well everyone you meet is heterosexual. And again, meanings of these meanings of heterosexuality varied over time. There are many great books talking about the social construction of heterosexuality. So again, that's not saying, you know, that being straight is not a normal thing for people who identify that way. It's not saying you've been taught that necessarily. But it's saying the kind of behaviors and attitudes we associate with heterosexuality change over time. So again, the age at which you get married, the amount of children you have, the kind of sex acts that straight individuals perform, all of those things, those are contingent on the time and place. Again, it's not saying that this is a product of today and in the past people were totally different, but just that what it means to be straight changes over time. So we have the two binaries, which again are framed as very different. Obviously, intrasexual attraction, intra meaning within, so gay, and then straight, kind of extra, so being interested in someone outside of your sex or gender. Now, where this starts to get complicated, so kind of the next couple slides increase in terms of complexity, this gets complicated with sexualities that don't fit into one of these two molds, either in terms of partner selection or non-partner selection, as we'll see with asexuality. So bisexuality is attraction to both male and female individuals. Typically, a bisexual is not, it doesn't include attraction to transgendered individuals. You'll see there's pansexual. Some individuals will be, but typically someone who identifies as bisexual is interested in what are called cisgendered males and females. So people whose sex and gender were mapped onto one another from birth. Although again, these latter three terms in particular are more up for debate and changing a lot. So bisexuality is very difficult. So just as how homosexuals have the whole issue of coming out and being closeted, bisexuals often have to go through this process multiple times in their life. So typically when someone comes out as gay, I mean, well not typically, but many times, people will say to them, oh, maybe you're just bisexual. You haven't found the right person within your sex and gender yet. Bisexual individuals have the flip side of that problem. When they announce to people that they're bisexual, very often people will say to them, oh, you just haven't made up your mind yet. You don't know. There's often resistance from other gay individuals, I know this personally, but there's also studies on this, of bisexuals getting a lot of backlash from both gay and straight individuals because it seems like they're choosing not to be part of either community. And gay individuals fought for a long time to say, you know, we're gay, we're not bisexual, we're not pansexual, we're not asexual, like it's a discrete identity. So in a way, bisexuals are kind of towing this line and being judged from both sides, which can be quite awful for these individuals. Oftentimes opposition comes to this group as well because of stereotypes about bisexual people being extremely sexually promiscuous, and even if they're serial monogamous, going one relationship to another, many people assume, okay, they're with me now, but they're going to want the other gender or sex eventually. I'm not both, so they're not going to be satisfied with me. So again, there's lots of reasons why bisexual individuals have a hard time. So kind of a further on the spectrum version of bisexuality is pansexuality. So this is more if you identify as someone, so say you're very often non-binary individuals, so people that don't identify as male or female or masculine or feminine, they just kind of embrace everything. They'll often be what's called pansexual, meaning that they just don't see people based on sex and gender. And I mean, they can tell a person's sex or gender probably the way other people can, but it's not important to them and their sexual orientation. It's much rarer than the other ones, just statistically, although it is growing in numbers as more people kind of feel comfortable coming out that way. But again, this is more just seeing, I guess, people as people outside of their sexuality. And then lastly, so kind of going in terms of extremes away from heterosexuality as the base, is asexuality. So if pansexual individuals are attracted theoretically to everyone, asexuals are attracted to no one. When I said sexuality can be physical and sexual, but also emotional, asexual individuals, it doesn't mean they don't want relationships. Very often they do, but they want to be celibate. So in the same way that a priest or a nun would be celibate, they would have a very special, intimate friendship. And it's still romantic, but without the intercourse. They might cuddle, they might do other things. Again, there's a spectrum of that, but the sex act for them is not important, and they may or may not identify as gay, straight, bi, or pan within it. So it's kind of a different thing. It's basically more about the act of intimate relations. You could still be straight and asexual, gay and asexual. It's more your sexual preference in terms of actions. So to open it up for discussion, so maybe, because again, we all have, again, I'm not that as tapped into youth culture as I like to think I am, and current events and issues and stuff. So if you can get in groups with your study buddies, and you'll see you'll have, or get in pairs, because you're going to see that you'll form a tight study buddy pair in the special thing we're doing afterwards. So bisexual, pansexual, and asexual individuals often face discrimination from both gay and straight individuals. Why do you think this is? So get with your study buddy, or whoever's next to you. You can do more than two if you want, but get with your study buddy and discuss. So I talked a little bit about bisexuality, but I didn't talk about the others so much. All right, so I'm hearing lots of great discussion. Okay, so who wants to discuss this issue first? Good. And I'll be sharing my voice.
Well, okay, I think the reason why they would face discrimination is because most people see, sex as either, you like the opposite sex, or you like the same sex. So maybe they could see something as bi, pan, or asexual as just kind of like a fringe thing that's just kind of new, like they're not used to it. Like they might think it's just missing its place, kind of.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So remember, part of heterosexism, if you view it that way too, it's not just a man being with a woman and a woman being with a man, but it's all the things that come along with it. So the idea that you'll have a nuclear family, so you'll have children, you'll buy property together, you'll have a long-term life partner. Those all get potentially challenged by the idea that there could be individuals interested in multiple sorts of people. We'll see that with non-monogamy, how that often does align itself with non-monogamy, although it doesn't have to. And the idea of someone not being intimately related to and in turn invested in one other person. Those challenge the idea of the family. So heterosexuality, again, going back to the Industrial Revolution, we needed lots of children. We didn't have high immigration rates back then. We needed children to keep the population alive. And so women and men were burdened with that idea of you need to have kids. People didn't have retirement pensions and all of these things, and they would just be having tons of kids. And the infant mortality rates were high, and so people kind of needed to do that from a societal level. So there's a lot of pressure on people in that way. So long-winded way of saying, these three identities can be seen as very much outside of the parameters of the nuclear family, whereas at least, I think, from the perspective of people that may still be a bit shocked by homosexuality, they could at least say, well, you can get married and adopt a kid and still kind of, for all intents and purposes, be like a hetero family. Anyone else? Good. I'm going to find that burglar who stole both of my microphones one day. Can't believe they stole both. Well, I couldn't throw the other one and kill someone.
I was just going to say that the same lack of understanding, that you said, between why there would be discrimination, why gay people face discrimination from straight people, also applies to the bisexual, pansexual, and asexual identities there, because both of these groups don't understand these individual sexualities totally, and also they might view it as a counterculture, like you said just then. I just wanted to take that further and say they might view it as a counterculture against their own cultural ideals.
Great, so the student connected it to the week on culture. So again, oftentimes when people are hesitant about another person or group, they're assuming motives of them. So these individuals could be seen as particularly rebellious or kind of choosing to be part of a counterculture. So those are other reasons why they may not be accepted. Okay, one more, at least. In the front?
Sure.
Okay.
So we were saying that people who are heterosexual and homosexual, they've always been like, do you like somebody who is the same gender as you or not? And if somebody says neither, sometimes I like both, sometimes not, things like that, maybe people get confused, right? So that's why they're like, well, which one are you? So that's one of the reasons why they face some discrimination. And then also, they have like historical context of like why they became, that became their like sexuality or sexualities. But when people don't understand it, right, they can be like, oh, they're just making it complicated. Because a lot of people nowadays, like not a lot of people, but like I realize that some people say, well, there's like way too many genders nowadays, way too many sexualities nowadays. It's just confusing and they're going over that line. So, but like there's biological reasons behind it probably, social reasons behind it probably, a lot of reasons to contribute that, right? So that's the reason.
Yeah, so great points. And again, I think it's particularly important. What I've always found more interesting was, again, and I'm not saying most gay people do this at all, but resistance to these identities is often unexpectedly from the gay community. And again, it's coming from a place of saying, maybe you're identifying as one of these because you haven't come to terms with the fact that you're gay. And that's something personal. I thought I was bisexual, half thought that for a while, and then realized I wasn't. And I think, everyone's different. There is a large proportion of people in each of these categories, and it's a very personal thing. So I think oftentimes when people are trying to be helpful, they'll say, maybe you're experimenting, but I see you with this kind of person, or why don't you just try that? So again, it's really a case-by-case basis. But I think as a sociologist, we'll say, okay, it makes sense that a heterosexual individual may be skeptical of these identities because they're not as aware of these identities themselves, and a homosexual individual as well may not be as aware of these. And then they may have different ways of thinking they're helping. So again, looking academically, looking at when each of these sexual categories emerged in a society, seeing how well represented they are, seeing what kind of social movements have been involved, can really help you make sense of why people are so divided in terms of how they think about these things. So let me just see the time. Okay, perfect. So we can take a 10-minute break, and then when we get back, we will resume our learning journey. And we'll see how these connect to ideas of monogamy and non-monogamy. Alrighty. Okay. So again, the 5 sexualities. We have heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, and asexual. Again, don't get super caught up in all the definitions. There's only 5 we're covering here. There are more. But again, just try to think, again, how they fit into that classic dichotomy of gay and straight, or homosexual and heterosexual, how that ties into heterosexism, homophobia, and then how bisexuality kind of represents this rupture in that dichotomy, which then is even further problematized by individuals attracted to people regardless of gender, and then, or gender expression, and then to asexual, so people not attracted to anybody, or sexually, so not wanting sexual contact with someone, that could still want to be partnered with an opposite sex member or intersex member, but not want that sexual component. So just to clarify some great questions in the break. So again, a person's sexual. So let's just see. So we're all on the same page. All right. So remember, our sexual orientation is whether we are one of those 5 categories, so whether we're straight or gay, and so on and so forth. And then your sexual identity. So sometimes the textbook can be slippy with both of those terms. I would think more of your sexual identity in terms of the word sex being whether you identify as male or female. I won't trick you with the 2 terms though, so just remember sexual orientation is more the who you're attracted to, and then anything revolving around identity is you. So I would say your sex is the sex you identify as. Again, these terms are all slippy, so in tests I'll try not to use more than one of them. Or I'll use them in a way where they mean the same thing. Okay, so again, I focused on pansexuality, asexuality, and bisexuality as stereotypically being the most disruptive. And this is because of their associations, or lack thereof, with monogamy. So again, going back, I always go back to the Industrial Revolution. Again, the idea that people were straight and women stayed at home with the kids and men went out to work. So monogamy was already a thing. I mean, monogamy has classically been a thing in Western history for hundreds of years. You can think of the Elizabethan era, Shakespearean times. People have kind of gotten married and had children to reproduce the nation, reproduce the community. So this is the definition, the coupling of 2 people, and very importantly, excluding the involvement of others. And the idea of monogamy, why it's so key and part of heterosexism, again, and I don't mean that, it sounds kind of worse than it is, but by heterosexism, again, I mean seeing heterosexual monogamous relationships as the default that most people will end up doing. Why this became such a default sexuality in terms of from a functionalist perspective, again looking at the Industrial Revolution, would be because of its protective factors. So rather than having people, again, obviously they didn't have these technologies, but rather than having people grind and tinned around the community, this says no, you have to have one partner and together you raise this family and you raise them well. So again, it's thinking of individuals as having a lot of social responsibility in this way. That's why people were so against promiscuity and all of these things, particularly female promiscuity, because if a woman cheated, then you wouldn't know who the kids are, and bloodlines would be all messed up from their perspective and all of this, plus patriarchal reasons of wanting to control women, of course. But this stability of the family as a community writ small, the kind of hearth or hub instantiation of the community, this was so tied with being straight and just living that way. And so this is seen in, oftentimes there are articles about this, and people identify even as what are called serial monogamists. So dating around and sleeping around and all of that is typically okay to people if you frame it around this idea that you're only seeing one person at a time and you're searching for Miss or Mr. Right. So you're not out, looking, you're not out, this isn't what you want to do, but ideally you want to find that one person. So a serial monogamist, again, is someone who, unfortunately, from their perspective, hasn't found Mr. or Mrs. Right, but they keep finding, Mr. Right Now and Miss Right Now or whatever. And someone for short term, and then it implodes for whatever reason. I know we've all been there, and I've definitely been in that trap as well. So again, historically, from a Western perspective at least, monogamy is the ideal, and serial monogamy is kind of people trying to get there. Now, contrary to that is non-monogamy. Now, non-monogamy is just quite simply having relationships with more than one other person. So this it has been widely tabooed and negatively sanctioned in Western history. You know, the idea, as we'll see, with polyamory is having kind of intimate relationships that often involve three people. So a non-monogamous person could have, you know, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, 2 girlfriends, 5 boyfriends, whatever. But they're all mutually exclusive, so you kind of have separate relationships. Someone in a polyamorous relationship could have separate relationships, but the difference is, and this is often what gets lost when these two get lumped together, in polyamory, so now people online and stuff, I know from trolling with dating sites and things, and I like to see the evolution of how categories change on them. Poly, as it's called, is now an identity choice, and people will often say on their online profiles, they'll say, I'm poly, looking for another poly person, which means that you've declared that one person is not what you want multiple, but you want it to involve mutual consent and long-term arrangements. So non-monogamy, and this is where the terms are important, so non-monogamy, think of it, again, and I'm not saying it's a stepwise hierarchy to bash non-monogamous people, but think of it this way. So there's monogamy, which is you're committing yourself to one person, then there's non-monogamy, which is saying I'm not committing myself to one person, and then there's polyamory, which is saying not only am I not committing myself to one person, but I need to find someone else who's okay with that and who will either support me being with multiple people or will also be with multiple people or with whom I can form like triadic and big relationships. So that's the difference. So oftentimes in the media, this just gets lumped up as people who want to cheat on other people. So the textbook goes into great detail on polyamory, saying no, there's a whole group of people growing in this way that are saying no, like let's have almost like small communities rather than just 2 people. People who want to be, you know, a group of 5 that are all intimate, or who have separate partners but are open about it. Again, these sorts of relationships, you know, you can think of things like swingers clubs. Show of hands if anyone knows what a swinger is. So some people, so a swinger is when you have like a spouse swap. So imagine your parents doing that, right? Hey, I brought you to a swingers club. And then it's consensual, they go there, and then it's like, okay, let's trade wives, or let's trade husbands for 2 weeks. And they have like PG-rated versions of that on TV with like House Swap, where obviously they're not doing anything sexual and it's all filmed. Or maybe behind closed doors, who knows. But it's the idea of trading lives, trading spaces. There's a lot of shows that do the non-sexual part of that, more just trading like life zones. But again, these are things that, you know, if you talk to people 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, they'd be shocked. They'd be like, what do you mean 4 people in a relationship? You're all just sexually, you know, freakish or something. But this is now becoming much more mainstream. Again, the idea of pansexual, not seeing people by gender, it then makes sense that some people may not want to just be with one person. They may see very different things in different people. And again, the long-standing, you know, not necessarily even ignorance of this, but people turning away against this, is the anti-community belief. Again, which is a stereotypical belief that people with non-heterosexual identities want to disrupt the social order, or revolt or be in chaos. And again, as you're seeing now with many social movements, particularly involving transgender individuals, these individuals just want to live their lives. They don't want to disrupt any social order. And in fact, they're creating many of their own communities. But that's where I think a lot of the chaos comes from. So little group discussion number 2. Again, I'll only ask for 1 or 2 examples. So I've framed it a certain way, but again, I don't know the lifeblood of the youths of Toronto and Scarborough. So are non-monogamous relationships socially acceptable? Which norms do these kinds of relationships support and or disrupt? So just talk about it. Talk about your own perceptions, your family's perceptions, your friends' perceptions with one another. Knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer. So talk with your study buddies for a little bit.
You know what? Sarah, I don't think that's
Alrighty. Okay. Anyone want to address? So just show of hands, I guess. So obviously, I just was framing it as not being necessarily socially acceptable. But in your own experiences, show of hands, have you found that if I didn't teach this, would you have thought that according to others, not you, so I'm not judging anyone, but according to others, would you think non-monogamous relationships are socially acceptable? Show of hands, yes. Okay. All right, so no, they're not. So which norms do you think these kinds of relationships support or disrupt? Remember, non-monogamy, so not polyamory, but kind of what people think of non-monogamy. What norms are associated with this that lead to that? So why, as a sociologist, I'm wondering, why is there so little social approval of this? What norms are being challenged or disrupted? Yep. That's a great point, yes, see, so that's why I asked you to come up with them. So monogamous relationships, people's partners, their wife or their husband, are often elevated above all the other relationships. So non-monogamy challenges that. It says you don't really have that core person necessarily. You may have multiple people like that, or maybe you're privileging a friend or something above that, but you don't have that kind of sacred bond. Anyone else? Yep.
Could you say like the idea of being faithful to like one person? It's like a social. I know it's like a social thing to like take everyone out and like just be loyal to your significant other.
Yeah. So the idea of being faithful. Remember, think of the word faithful. Having faith in your partner. Trusting that they'll only be with you. Going on faith means you are bracketing your doubt and skepticism and kind of just blindly hoping and accepting that the person will actually just be loyal to you and not cheat on you. So non-monogamy, when someone cheats on someone else, their friends go nuts and it's like they hate the person and everything because they broke that sacred bond. So again, it's linked to if you're in a monogamous relationship, again, non-monogamy is typically one person cheating or straying. That's seen as so devastating because it means you've ruptured that bond. And so in one person's mind, it was totally elevated, and maybe in the others it is too, but they've still chosen to stray from that home. Yeah. Great idea, great observation there. So the idea of the nuclear family and the pressure that people that even though they're in committed relationships, I like the idea of the hierarchy you put there. You get married and then you have children. So a lot of people now, the numbers of common law people are really expanding. My partner and I, it'll be 5 years this next year. We're not getting married. Luckily, being gay, people don't ask you as much if you're getting married. It's kind of like, oh, you're in a long-term relationship. That's good. I don't want to curse this. But for my sister, my eldest sister actually has been with her fiance, I don't know what to call him now, but fiance for 21 years. And it was the whole idea that they decided pretty early on that they wanted to be childless, but they didn't want to deal with the whole ordeal of getting married and then having all the questions. So again, great observations. There's a lot of societal pressure. Again, there's more and more pressure being put on non-heterosexual people too. But there's a ton of pressure traditionally on heterosexual individuals to have this family. And so non-monogamy flies in the face of that. It's kind of like the biggest Red Cross against that idea of, again, the safe family that's concentrated on rearing and raising children. And so you could have a whole class on childlessness too, or wanting children later, or any of those questions. Just the pressure people feel to do that, particularly from their parents and so on. So sexuality and gender. So again, I've already drawn these connections before, so I won't spend a lot of time now. So as we see, gender and sexuality are very linked. So sexuality is embedded within our gender, social class, race, age, ability, all of that. That sounds abstract, but again, just as I talked about those idealized images of men and women, they're connected to that. There are idealized sexualities. So you can often, idolize sexual partners. So for example, if you are a young person, so let's say, just for sake of argument, whatever, let's say you're 20, if you start going out with someone that's 50 or 60, many of your friends may assume that you are a gold digger, or you have a daddy or mommy complex or something. They may, there's an assumption that you want to be with someone your own age. Also, there's like a desirability hierarchy, so people typically would say a younger partner is ideal, both for aesthetic reasons, but also then if you do stay monogamous, that the younger person can then take care of you when you're older. The one benefit, the stereotypically of having an older partner, I mean there are many, obviously, but some benefits attached there again would be assuming they have financial stability, assuming they have maturity, but all of these things are desired kind of things in a sexual partner. If you introduce someone who didn't have a good job, wasn't educated, was mean, or all these sorts of things that aren't desirable in our society, the question you may get from your peers is, why did you choose that person? So the people's choice of sexual partner, and this is where things become really interesting as a sociologist. It's not just a pure biological thing. If you find you're attracted to someone who, has great command of the scene when they're at restaurants, or they know a lot about knowledge, or like they're very smart, or they're very funny, or they get along really well with your friends, or you feel you could take them home to your parents easily. All of those things may be very important to your identity and how you see other people sexually, but it's kind of hard to categorize those around something natural when they're very tied into what you expect out of your life. And so just as we perform gender every day with what we wear, we perform this sort of more sexual orientation as well. So again, it's not just that you're gay or straight. You may be interested in certain kinds of people based on how they present themselves or not. Again, all those stereotypes I gave before, looking at men, for example, if you're into hipsters or suave guys or jocks or whatever, all of those things are tied to your own identity and your own personality in a way that isn't just about, sexual organs or male or female or whatever. And so just as our gendered selves are fluid over time, our sexual selves are fluid too. Again, that doesn't mean every person is going to be jumping around from straight to gay to bisexual and all of that. But even if you just think of, most of the people here are quite young, but if you think of yourself over your life, unless you marry your high school sweetheart or whatever, for many people, the kind of man or woman or non-binary person, whatever, the kind of person you like will likely change over time. So for myself, I liked people my own age for a while, then I liked people older than me, and then, I liked, when I was in different phases of my life, there was a time I dated gamers a lot, and then I dated people that were like stable business types. All those things changed as my own identity was changing, and I was trying to think, where am I seeing myself? Who do I want to be that elevated special person, as the student mentioned? So those things change as you get older. And again, that's why sometimes, if you think, when you think of that idea of, will my parents approve of this person? Often their approval is coming from them thinking that this partner doesn't fit into their idea of what your life is. So people often have big fights with their friends over partners based on that idea of fit. Having a partner is almost kind of like having a career. People could say, you know, I don't see you with that kind of person. I don't see you in that sort of job. I see you this other way. And the sexual double standard, which we'll see, that's very apparent. So think of, in terms of these identities, I've been framing it as though, you know, for male and female, it's very much the same. But as we know, it's not. Societally, women's sexuality has been much more controlled and constrained than men. And looking at language, we see this quite clearly. So we'll have a discussion about it later. But the term slut, for example, yes, we've reappropriated that somewhat, but you can't really, that word hasn't really been applied to men, or it doesn't have the same meaning to men. Usually it's said in a joke form, whereas if you call a woman a slut, it's much more offensive, because again, it ties back to this idea that women are supposed to be much more in charge of their sexualities. They're not as sexual to begin with, so if they are acting kind of hypersexual, then there's something wrong with them, or they're being deviant. All these things, you know, I can't speak to it, I'm not a woman, but I can imagine many women have gone through this experience of feeling they need to control themselves more, or they can't get away with things that guys can. We'll get to a discussion question later about the social movement of slut walk, where, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but at York University they had this big protest because when there was a bunch of sexual assaults at the York University campus, one of the police officers around the police that area, he said, well, women would get attacked less if they didn't dress like such sluts. And that obviously raised a lot of public outrage, basically blaming the victims and reinforcing kind of this sexual double standard. Because again, you wouldn't think of that with a man, even with a gay man. If a gay man's sexually assaulted by another man, no, very rare, or I've never heard anyway, someone saying, well, if he wasn't so flirtatious, that wouldn't happen. So again, it's these ideas, as I've stated, are tied again to the ideals of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. So again, on the one hand, men are seen as both, ironically, knowing a lot about sex. So the idea of calling them a slut, it's more, you know, they're a player. If they're with a lot of women, they're scoring a lot of women. Women are seen as getting as harder to get, so they've won over a lot of women. They have all these kind of very seemingly bizarre players clubs and stuff. One of my friends, he did his master's thesis on the group of guys. I don't remember what it's called. It was called the Code Book or something. But it's like rules on how to score women at bars and classrooms and all of this. And so he interviewed these guys that were really into that subculture, and they were like, you know, follow these 10 steps and you'll get a woman like 3 levels out of your league and whatever, all this stuff. How not to get friend zoned, all this stuff. So again, that's tied into the idea that men are aggressive, they're the sexual aggressors, they want sex, they want partners, whereas women, they should be subordinating themselves to those desires. So this is why in sociology and gender studies, there's a lot of resistance to overplaying the biological component of sexuality, because very often people think, well, men get biologically aroused in a way that women don't, although women do, obviously, but they're the ones that, you know, have these uncontrollable sexualities, and then they are going to be hunting women, and women have to be selective, and it's their fault. If a man and woman get together, the woman should have said no. She should have not dressed that way. She should have controlled it. So all of these ideas, again, you'll see that's why gender and sexuality, again, in many textbooks and many courses, they're put in the same week. And even in, you know, upper level courses, you'll see they're often put in the same week. Because whenever you think of sexuality, it's almost always linked to these ideas of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity, or the overall expectations of what we think the two prime halves of our population are doing. Okay, so last little bit of discussion. So there have been numerous attempts to reclaim the word slut, that's just one word, in order to resist the negative connotations. So again, shifting away from having, so just to explain what that means. So what Slut Walk was trying to do was say, in no way is rape and sexual assault ever justified. Just as we don't blame men for how they dress if they're sexually assaulted, we shouldn't be blaming women for this. Just as how men can be called players in all of this without a negative connotation, this should be applicable to women as well. So reappropriating the word slut means saying, you know, view it the same way you would player, or another male slut version word that doesn't have a negative connotation. So there have been some social movements, but again, as students, what else do you think could be done to shift how this term is used? So this is more conceptual than the other questions, but what do you think, so to open it up more, how do you think the idea of kind of female or feminine promiscuity could shift from being seen as a negative thing to a neutral or positive thing even? So discuss with your study buddies. Again, these are just all things to get you jived up. Okay. All right. So does anyone have any ideas of how we could change the way this word's used over time, or how people could do that? Yep.
So I think, like, if they do like slut walks, right? The word slut is so like stigmatized in a way. So change that word into prosexual. I was just searching it out. Yeah, I think it's a very like neutral kind of word for it. So yeah, promote that word instead.
No, it's a great point. So the student says maybe changing the word altogether because of all the cultural and historical baggage with the term slut. So oftentimes this is a debate among people, among social movement people and scholars about whether it's worth reclaiming words. I mean, I'm not going to go into them, but there are many racial slurs and even body slurs about weight and things that have been reclaimed over time that members of those communities can use or use in their own private lives, but they typically never become mainstream discourse, and they're still offensive when people outside of those groups use it. So it is difficult in a way to imagine if ever calling a woman a slut would be a positive thing coming from a man. Maybe girls could joke around with that, or women could joke around, but it could be hard to imagine it ever reaching that place because of all the other meanings it had, and you not knowing whether the person is meaning that older meaning or the new one, right? So that's a good point. So a new word, so prosexual. Anything else? Yep.
So one thing we were talking about was kind of turning it slowly into sort of slang kind of way. So the same way things like bitch became kind of like a slang sort of thing and stopped being as offensive. That could be it. So if you use it more just sort of sarcastic way, maybe it would start like becoming less negative.
Right, so using the word as slang, so like the word bitch, again, that can be used very offensively if you call someone that, but basically any word, if you use it with the right tone and enunciation, it can be harsh. But that often is used in a much more joking way, and then even used by men to other men, depending on the circle of friends. But changing the meaning of the word very radically to have almost nothing to do with what it originally meant in many contexts is another way to change it. Yeah, so again, this question is just to get you designed to think, you know, again, and I heard some good discussions about how other words like, you know, how a group of guys could call a woman easy, but you don't think of women calling guys easy unless it's on like those social experiment videos. It's just not usually words they would use or the way they would view one another. So you think, again, as a sociologist, when you get into social engineering and thinking of norms and all of that, think what would it look like for women to categorize men the way that men often categorize women with terms like this. Okay, so we just have a little bit left. Yeah, just a few more slides, and then we're done. So I think the application to these big to like the core theories of the class, sexualities, particularly because it piggybacks so much on the gender week, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But I always want to bring these in a little bit just to keep your appetite up for these theories and viewing things through theory. And again, the more tests I look at, I would say about half of the 200 or so that I looked at in the bonus question all said that you really love viewing the world through these theories. So I don't know whether you're just gassing me or whether it's real, but either way, I'll take it. So I'm going to continue with a little bit of the theory stuff. So again, functionalism, like the word, when they're studying sexuality and sexualities, their central question is always, how is sexuality or how is functional sexuality important to the running of society? So again, if you're looking at the dominance of heterosexuality in a society, a functionalist might turn back to the Industrial Revolution and say, well, heterosexuality was an adaptation to changing times. Men had to go out to work, someone needed to stay home, that happened to be women, and then this whole marriage arrangement was built to keep this kind of family unit intact and in sync. And looking at things like sex work, prostitution, other forms of things that have historically been considered deviants, or forms of deviance, they would ask, what functions does this form? So for example, or perform. So prostitution, for example, functionalist explanations of this say, well, men are more biologically primed or whatever, or sexually primed than women, and prostitution, the oldest profession in the world as it's often called, is established so that men can be faithful to their wives, not cheat on them with other women, but instead cheat on them with sex workers. So it's still cheating, but it's different from becoming really romantically involved with someone else. So it's a kind of way of keeping the peace and doing that behind closed doors. The idea of having mistresses and all of that. And again, that's obviously been deeply gendered. Conflict theory would be more interested in asking the question, so why, like what function does sexuality have for society? Why has it turned out this way? Conflict theory would be looking more for hidden power inequalities in this issue. So they would be more interested in seeing how our sexuality has been policed and surveilled over time, and who's benefiting from this. So they would be looking at how the recent kind of increases in forms of sexualities showcase how historically sexuality has been limited. We've always had the possibility to see more of ourselves that way, but that's been constrained. And so they would look at things like those GQ magazines and all those magazines I talked about as commodifying our sexuality, really putting our sexuality in the marketplace. So, you know, the media and all sorts of other outlets teaching us to look a certain way, act a certain way, gear ourselves towards certain occupations. All of this might, yes, in a way be functional for society, but it's benefiting certain corporations that are profiting off of our sexualities. Symbolic interactionism, again, the kind of atheoretical, most atheoretical in this sense, as usual. They're interested more in how people make sense of their sexualities and how they learn them over time. So the concept of sexual scripts is used here. So these are just the ways in which we understand our sexuality and are taught to us by society over time, by our parents, by the media, by our educators. So things like what is sexual reproduction and intercourse? As a woman, who am I attracted to? As a man, who am I supposed to be attracted to? How do I make sense of my hormonal feelings? All of these things, symbolic interactionists would just be interviewing people and seeing what their sexualities mean to them and seeing how they fit into these scripts and these norms. Again, a sexual script is simply just things you see in your society around sexuality. So kind of norms about how men and women and even non-binary and other individuals, how they're supposed to be acting sexually. Post-structural theory is very similar, so you may find confusion in the textbook. It's often the post-structuralist theory and symbolic interactionism. Their core similarity is that they're very interested in how people make sense of things, but post-structuralism is a conflict theory at heart. So remember, all the contemporary theories are very informed around the subject of power. They look at imbalance and inequality. So symbolic interactionism, again, is not super interested in any of that. It's more just how do people make sense of their sexualities, how do they learn to be sexual beings and all of that. Post-structuralist theory sees, like conflict theory, that our sexualities are very regulated by society. So basically what they do is they look at that idea of sexual scripts that symbolic interactionism looks at. That's there called discourses. So they look at that society provides us scripts, but unlike symbolic interactionism, they don't say these are power neutral. So it's not that society just happens to have certain scripts and definitions of sexuality. They would say these are rooted in heterosexist norms. So going back to that Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just that norms of heterosexuality were emerged at this time, but they were patriarchal ones. So going into feminist post-structuralism, which is kind of a more refined version of post-structuralist theory in this. They would say that our versions of sexuality are deeply shaped by the country's patriarchal history. So again, hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity, working not just to enforce heterosexuality, but also to enforce unfair gender relations, with men literally on top and women subordinate to that. Men's sexuality being privileged, men not being labeled things like slut, and all of that baggage falling onto women. So again, in terms of functionalist theory, again, it's all about the research questions you have and what your position on society is. Again, a functionalist is looking more for why does this thing exist in a neutral way. Conflict theorist is saying who is benefiting from this, why did it evolve to benefit someone. Symbolic interactionism, what does it mean to people right now? And then post-structuralism and feminist post-structuralism, not only what does it mean to people and why did it evolve the way it did, but how is power involved in that process? So again, you'll see the textbook, why contemporary theories all involve power is, I think when you analyze most things, it makes sense to consider to what extent is power and inequality involved. And then lastly, the one that's most particular to LGBT and the kind of four other sexualities aside from heterosexuality. As I mentioned many times before, queer theory reappropriated, so why I had that question about the term slut, it reappropriated the term queer and, very important, challenged the idea that people had to be part of these heterosexual nuclear families. And they wanted to shake up the norms that constrain our sexualities of saying, you should be with this kind of partner, you should get married at this point, sexual consummation should happen after marriage. All of these norms that they've said we've just kind of accepted like cheerful robots, queer theorists caused us to see all of that like a true kind of Peter Berger-style sociologist, making the familiar strange, saying, why is it that most people identify as straight? Why is it that so many people have children? Why is it that people are against non-monogamy or polyamory or whatever the topic is? So again, queering sexuality, literally flipping it on its head and saying, why have we subscribed to all of these norms? So just some questions to think about going forward as I prepare our fun activity. So how far have our views on sexuality come? So again, we have the 5 sexualities, but as the discussion questions I've given made us think about, it doesn't mean that there's no resistance. So think, which members of the population in your own life, just in your imagination, like what you know about society, who do you think is resisting other kinds of sexuality and why? Can you think of examples that would demonstrate that sexualities other than heterosexuality are becoming normalized? So even though there's some resistance, there are more people identifying as these sexualities. What sociological factors do you think promote that? There is increased inclusion. It's not perfect, but who are some people in your own life or the media that you would see as kind of exemplars of these other sexualities? Not that any sexuality should have an exemplar in that way, but think of someone who you could easily map into one of the categories. And then again, know what monogamy, serial monogamy, non-monogamy, and polyamory are. So remember, there's the 5 sexualities, and then these are more linked to your, not only the gender of your partner, but the style of your relationship. So there's one thing to be in a gay relationship, and then there's another to be a gay serial monogamist, or gay polyamory, or any sort of thing. And then what's the relationship between gender and sexuality, and what do queer theorists argue about the relationship? So again, our sexual ideals, the sexual personae or identities we go after are often either really conforming to hegemonic masculinity or emphasized femininity, or are very much deviating from those things. So when you're interested in a certain partner, oftentimes they're an image of masculinity or femininity that you've seen, or one that you're rejecting. If you like a much more effeminate man or a masculine woman, for example, they're still often in dialogue with those ideas of gender. And then, of course, the core sexualities, or the most dominant ones of straight and gay, being based on people's gender identities. Okay, so any questions? We have no more tutorials or anything left this term. I know this is a full year class, so show of hands if you have exams in your other classes. You must all have exams. Yeah. So for this class, I would encourage you to not think about it for a little while. Focus on your exams. You have tutorials this week, so this week will be just it's a freebie week kind of thing, so that's also the other bonus. If you go this week, it's not a big, intense thing, but it's the test review. So they'll be going over common errors that people made. Again, don't be super concerned if you didn't, the average was good on the first test. Some people, there were 5 people that got 100. So some people did really well. I'm gonna send out emails to those people, they know who they are, about organizing potentially them creating like a study guide for the future tests, because I was really excited that a handful of people, a bunch of people got over 90, but there were people that literally got 100 on both sections. So I'm hoping we can get together, write a study guide, and looking at the feedback, I know people would like more active like preps and stuff, and so seeing students that did well, I mean, I try to prepare you guys, but I know obviously you read differently than me and all of that, so having some very successful students help with that, I'm going to try to have that in the works. So this will be test review, and then I'm going to approach those students and see if I can figure that out. You don't have anything due until January 14th for the Monday section. So I would do those quizzes, but prioritize your exams, because those are coming up immediately. And keep this in the back of your mind, and try to get excited, think about your ideas for the literature review. But that's it. And remember, do try to keep yourself accountable with your study buddy. They'll remember what you told them on the paper, even though you don't have the paper anymore. And then have a great holiday break.